Well, let's begin. We are in the middle of talking about Joshua and how he was prepared to undertake the task that God had given him. Remember, Joshua is poised to lead the conquest of the promised land. He's on the eastern side of the Jordan, in the plains of Moab, and we haven't even started verse 1 yet. Well, we kind of looked at it, but we haven't started the book of Joshua. Why? We said, well, we want to know what God has done in his life to prepare him for this moment. Aren't there some of these principles that God has taught him that we need to know as well? And I'll tell you, I've trimmed it because we would be here for the whole series. There is so much in Joshua's life that you can draw, and we could really spend a lot of time in it. But I limited it down to 4 major events at which there are 3 principles in each one. Make it easy to remember. And that's the escape from Egypt, the battle at Rephidim just before they camped at Sinai for a year, and those we covered last week. Today we're going to cover the covenant meal on the mountain, which is fascinating, and then the golden calf rebellion. These are great truths that God has taught him, and I think they could teach us as well. Just by way of review, if you recall, from the time that Moses came back from Midian to the time that they arrived at Sinai, I call that the escape from Egypt. We have seen 3 principles. God's power is supreme and his will is irresistible. We live in times when the world feels like it's falling apart. Great powers are doing terrible things. We worry about nuclear war. I really like the fact that God didn't choose some backwater chieftain in some third-rate country to humiliate. He found the biggest, the baddest, the most powerful civilization in the world in that day, and he took the Pharaoh and he destroyed him. So there's nothing in this world that you and I need to fear if our Heavenly Father is that powerful. His will is irresistible. He has told us what he is going to do. He is going to bring us to himself. And there's nobody that can stop that. Isn't that great news? Secondly, when he leads you into darkness, trust him and obey. Remember, he took them down to the edge of the Red Sea. They were trapped. The Pharaoh's army was coming through the only exit. And they said, God, why did you put me here? Have you ever said that? I'll bet you have. And so have I. And what he's saying is, when God leads you into the darkness, trust him and obey. Trust and obey. There's no other way. Thirdly, where God leads, he's going to provide. And we also notice a little pattern. Each time he provided more abundantly till they got to the last stop before Sinai, which was Rephidim, and he brought the water out of the ground through that split rock in abundance. And it's living water. In the Bible, living water means life. And we've heard Jesus say, I've come that they might have life, and might have it abundantly. And it's true that as we walk with Christ longer and longer and longer, life becomes more abundant. It becomes more wonderful. Then there's the battle at Rephidim. The Amalekites attacked, and then Joshua had to go down there and fight. Now, what's really interesting, first principle was the Lord's battle has to be joined. Most people take the lesson from that the battle is the Lord's. Well, it is. All battles are the Lord's. But we have to join some of them. Sometimes he will take us where he wants us to go regardless. He has redeemed us, and we had nothing to do with it. But then he says, jump into the arena, and I want you to struggle with sin. I want you to struggle with evil, and I want you to depend upon me. We are called to join God in his battles, just like Joshua had to go down there. Some men were killed. Some men bled. It was not a pretty sight. It was a battle, a war. And so we must join as well. God is a God of war. People do not like to hear that. I told you about Dave Moiston's song, The Warrior. And did he get a lot of grief out of that, right? Like, tremendous amount of grief. My God is not a God of war. Yes, he is. There is an enormous war that we are engaged in, called the conflict of the ages between God and Satan and his angels, between good and evil. And we are involved in that war. Remember the Chinese Christian that was asked, what's the difference between American Christians and Chinese Christians? His answer was, the American Christians have no idea that they're at war. When we were kids, we used to sing, onward Christian soldiers going into war. A mighty fortress is our God. A bulwark never failing. His power amid the soil of mortal ills prevail. though still our ancient foe doth seek to work us woe. His craft and power great, and armed with cruel hate. One little word shall fell him. God is at war. God is a God of vengeance. And I use the word of vengeance because it makes us very uncomfortable. The vengeance of God is his prerogative. He gives life, he can take life. He creates disaster, he creates blessing. And he is the sovereign who will one day fix every evil and bring it to justice. Sometimes he does it temporally, like he did with the Amalekites. Sometimes he will do it eternally. But ultimately, every evil will be recompensed. Every wrong will be righted. And God will be sovereign. So the next place that we hear about Joshua after the Battle of Rephidim is at Mount Sinai. Now, the Israelites spent a full year at Mount Sinai. These are the things that happened. We don't have to spend a lot of time talking about that. The mountain that I showed you a picture of is Jebel al-Lawz, which is in the middle of the land of Midian in northwestern Arabia. It's not on the Sinai Peninsula, but it's the best candidate I can think of for Mount Sinai. And it also has a certain amount of evidence, although there's not a lot available because you can't get there. The Saudis won't let you go there. But we have some photographic evidence. And we went through that in the Moses series, and you can get that on YouTube if you want. But you notice there's a lot of things that happened during that year. For example, Moses made at least 6 trips up the mountain, and maybe more. And the Bible tells us that twice he spent 40 days and 40 nights without food or water. So that's quite amazing. But the most important event was this one here. The Great Assembly at Mount Horeb. Sometimes it's really referred to as the Assembly at the Mountain of God, or the Assembly at the Mountain. And that is where God spoke to the people as a whole from Mount Sinai. And actually, these first 2 events constitute a marriage. It is a covenant of marriage between God and the nation of Israel. The Old Testament refers to Israel as the wife of Jehovah. The church is what? The bride of Christ. When will our marriage supper take place? In glory, right? So there's a difference. But Israel is the wife of Jehovah. In Ezekiel chapter 16, where God probably gives his most passionate complaint about an unfaithful wife, is verse 16:8. He says, I gave you my solemn oath. And this is what he's referring to. And entered into a covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine. Like when you said, I do, and they pronounced you man and wife, she became your wife, and he became your husband. You owned one another in a very special relationship. So I want to take a look at that briefly. It's fascinating the way this covenant wedding parallels our weddings. You notice this? First of all, you have God's proposal, and that's right up here. Jack, could you read that for us?
You yourself, Exodus 19:4, is that what you want?
Yep, 19:4-6. Is that I bore you on eagle's wings?
Yes. No, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings. Yes, there it is. I'm sorry. And brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations, you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites.
Will you marry me? Right? That's really what God said. Would you enter into a covenant with me? Interesting. Israel didn't say, oh God, would you please enter into a covenant with me? God, the creator of heaven and earth, the one who spread the galaxies in space, comes to human beings and he said, would you make a covenant with me? That's a proposal. Now, we're not going to go through all the details. In chapter 19, verse 8, they say, yes, we will. They accept the proposal, just like we would. We don't want to do. Let's not go there, Caroline. You do the proposal, and then she says, yes or no, right? And she said, yes. You have the engagement period. It says, let there be 3 days. No, abstain from sexual relations. We want you to wash and be clean and clean your clothes and change your clothes. Put on your best duds and then appear before me. And then God appears on the top of the mountain and he states the terms of the engagement. And he speaks the 10 commandments to the entire assembly, and he gives some more of those terms to Moses for a few days on the mountain. Moses comes back down, he tells everybody about it, and he says, well, what do you say? This is the terms of the contract. This is the marriage contract. And of course, most of us have a marriage contract. You do have a prenup sometimes. Well, it's very common in the world to have a marriage contract. And so God has given the terms of the contract, and Israel says, yes, I do. Okay? And then Moses has a sacrifice, and the covenant is sealed in blood. And they sacrifice some animals, they shed some blood, interesting. And first he sprinkles the blood on the altar. It's God's part. And then he asks the people, and he, by the way, has written down the contract. He has written down in the book of the law what the terms of the contract are. And so he says, will you? And they solemnly say, I do, just like we do in the wedding. Terms of the contract is proposed. Now, we might get a charge to the bride and groom, or we say our vows. It's the same thing. And so God gives them the terms. Israel says, I do. And the covenant is then sealed in blood. How many of you had communion at your wedding? Several of you, yeah. Why is that? Why'd you do that? Because it's a good idea, because it looks good. We have the unity candle, and we do all. Albert, turn that little thing to you. Thanks.
Because the Lord set it up as a covenant in his blood to remember him until he returns.
Okay. And when we get married, Christian marriage, very often we invoke the blood of Christ as the unifying factor that brings us together. This is why it's so difficult for a mixed marriage to succeed.
Yeah.
But when we invoke this covenant in blood, it is a covenant, very much along these ancient lines. Now, the next thing they do is they have a covenant meal. And for us, that's what? The reception, the reason most of us like going to weddings anyway. There'll be dancing, there'll be great music, there'll be good food and drink. It's a lot of fellowship, a lot of fun. And in fact, some of us kind of get itchy at the wedding ceremony saying, let's go, let's go to the reception. That's a time of joy. It's a time when the covenant is celebrated. And they did this. Very interesting. It says in chapter 24, 9-11, that they went up on the mountain, 75 of them, Moses, Aaron's two sons, who would be priests, right? And then 70 elders, of whom Joshua would have been one. We'll see that in a minute. And they went up on the mountain and they ate and drank and saw God. Now, I want to focus on that a little bit. Let's read Exodus 24, 1-2, and then skip over and do 9-11. Okay, John, check.
Then he said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. You are to worship at a distance, but Moses alone is to approach the Lord. The others must not come near, and the people may not come up with him. Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of sapphire, clear as the sky itself. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God, and they ate and drank.
Now, it's interesting. It said they were to come up on the mountain, but not all the way up. They were to be at a distance and worship at a distance, and they ate and drank and saw God. Let's get just a little bit of context here. I love this. This is Google Earth. This is not a photograph from the air, but this is, eventually it's a satellite photograph that's stretched onto a contour map based on radar. Okay, that's how Google gives you a 3D picture. So it gives you the big picture. It can't pick up things like rocks and stones, but it can pick up the general topography. And we can see what this area looks like. Right here is the peak, the highest point. That's Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. And if you look to the west, down at the bottom of the mountain, that's where that split rock that we saw last week is, and that is Rephidim. Okay. And interestingly, the Israelites had to travel. And I drew, which I saw would be the most probable route, just based on the fact that you got a lot of people in a long line and you got to move along wadis and riverbeds. And it's almost 50 miles. And they come to the other side of the mountain, and that is Israel's camp. And it stretched for quite a ways. We'll have some better pictures of that in a minute. But here's what's interesting. Right here, between the peak and Israel's camp, is a plateau. Okay, it's a small plateau. But what you got to have is you got to have room for 75 people, right? So we're going to go up there, we're going to eat and drink and see, oh, we got to have a place to do this. So you're looking for a flat place, and there's one. That seems like it's a good candidate. And then you ask a lot of questions that we just don't have answers for. How did they get fed? Oh, did they bring a bag lunch? You bring a bag lunch when you go eat and drink with God? No, you don't do that, right? Well, did the angels provide food? What was it like? I just am dying to find out. I probably will have to die to find out. But anyway, I want to shift the view for you so you keep your bearings, okay? Right now, we're out here and we're looking back, okay, at the mountain and the plateau and Israel's camp. I'm going to go take my helicopter and move over the camp and look back the other way, okay? So we're going to do that. And this is a little closer up. This is the peak, okay? And this is this flat area, which I would say is the site of the meal. Then you come down here and you'd come down to where the Israelite camp was. Okay. Now that's really good because it meets the requirement to worship at a distance, right? They're worshiping at a distance from the peak. And then Moses and Joshua, as we'll see in a minute, could leave, and then they could go down here and climb back up. And in fact, Joshua would have gone with Moses at least to some point in here. They waited for 7 days, and then Moses was called up to the mountain, and he stayed there for 40 days and 40 nights. Interesting, when they left, they told the elders to wait in place until he came back. And I don't think they did, because after a few days, they would have said, this is ridiculous. We got to go back home. But Joshua did. He was there because he came down with Moses at the time of the Golden Calf Rebellion. Exodus 24, verses 12 to 14. Jack, you want to read that?
The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and stay here, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and commandments I have written for their instruction." Then Moses set out with Joshua, his aide, and Moses went up on the mountain of God. He said to the elders, "Wait here for us until we come back to you. Aaron and Hur are with you, and anyone involved in a dispute can go to them."
Now, there's several ways you could work out the logistics of this. I don't pretend to know, but it looks to me like Joshua went with Moses. And in any case, we know that Joshua was present at this meal, and he left with Moses, and he could at least go partway to where God was, and then he stayed until Moses came back. This is just a quick look. This gives you an idea how rough it really is. You don't get that from satellite, you know. And the plateau is here where this arrow is and to the right. And this, we're at the peak. Here, this is one of the few photographs that exist of this. Okay. So, well, what is the existence? What is the significance of this this event? Let's read Exodus 24, 9 to 11 again, Jack.
Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of sapphire, clear as the sky itself. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God, and they ate and drank.
Now, so far, every encounter with God that Joshua has seen since Moses returned has been dominated by God's effect on earthly things, mostly with power and mostly in conflict, right? We have all the 10 plagues that God inflicted on the Egyptians. We have the escape from Egypt, the forced march, and then the parting of the Red Sea, the destruction of Pharaoh's army, and the provision that God gave them of manna and quail, all the way up to where they are now. Everything Joshua and the Israelites have seen has been earthbound, hasn't it? What's missing? it's important that the Israelite leaders and Joshua lift their eyes and see something beyond it. And so God gives them a dazzling picture of his glory. Now, the image on the screen here, go online and look for imagery. Len knows how tough that is, right? And you'll see some of the goofiest stuff when you try to talk about these visions. But this is not bad. This one is, it comes from Ezekiel's vision in Ezekiel 1. And the thing I want you to notice is, you see this thing here? That floor, that pavement, or whatever that thing is, that you can see through to the throne of God. Now, what's interesting is that it seems very similar to what Joshua saw on the mountain. In fact, there are many places where there are what we call theophanies, where God appears to men. We have the burning bush to Moses. We have Abraham. Apparently, God appeared to him with 2 or 3 angels. They look like men. And there are other places where God has revealed himself in some way or another. But these are the 4 that I can think of in the Bible that God gives us a peek into something beyond this universe. And it's interesting to me how similar they are. For example, it says there's a foot of a throne, okay? Well, there's a throne high and lifted up in Isaiah 6, 1-5. And you can read these for yourselves. There'll be a throne above in Ezekiel 1. And then Revelation talks about the throne of God around the sea of glass, okay? There's bright blue light, train filling the temple, maybe light. Here's brilliant light, blazing lamps. 2 of them have a rainbow. 3 of them have these strange creatures, seraphim, cherubim, whatever, cloud and smoke. Now, in the faint, grayed out portions, that's not what this vision in the covenant meal shows, but it does show what was either slightly before, slightly after, so we could throw that in there. Violent tremors, shaking, roar, tumult, thunder, fire, 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 lightning, lightning, lightning. But this is the one that we're reading about now. Pavement made of sapphire, clear as the sky itself. A sparkling expanse throughout Ezekiel, like ice. That's this one right here. Maybe a bluish ice or something. And then in John's not underneath it. John's above it. And he sees the throne of God. And around the throne of God is a sea of glass, utterly still. Isn't that amazing? How similar all these things are. Now, about this thing, we'll call it a pavement, all right? There's a commentary that, go ahead, Jack, why don't you read this description of pavements?
Ancient monarchs, when they appeared in full state, sat on thrones or tribunals erected on floors of surpassing beauty. They were formed of painted tiles or of blue or sapphire color, and it is now well known that the floor in the Mosque of Omar at Jerusalem is almost entirely covered over with green and blue bricks, which are glazed, so that when the sun shines, they perfectly dazzle. But as those tiles were not transparent, Moses, in order to describe the pavement under the feet of the God of Israel with due majesty, represents it as like the floors of painted tiles he had seen in Egypt, but transparent as the body of heaven, literally as the heaven itself, the very heaven.
In John chapter 19, Jesus is pulled by Pilate for his final judgment onto a place called the Pavement, which would have been like this. And any description you might get of Byzantium, where the emperors of Byzantium would receive people, the incredible impression of glory that was surrounding them. So he's drawing on that imagery. And so you want to imagine that at this meal, these elders and Joshua are looking at a throne of God upwards through a magnificent colored window of precious minerals with the glory of heaven's light shining through, more brilliant and beautiful than any sky. Isn't that nice? Wow. It makes you think a little bit of the New Jerusalem in Revelation, where the walls are 200 feet thick and 1,500 miles long and made of solid diamond, clear as crystal. See, the God who can make a diamond and can make a hunk of coal, he could make a wall of diamond, 200 feet thick. And as all the foundations are made of precious stones. And it's beautiful beyond imagining. It says in verse 11 that they saw God. How do you see God? Well, in 1 Timothy 6:15 and 16, Jack, would you read that for us?
The King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who alone is immortal and who lives in unapproachable light, whom no one has seen or can see, to him be honor and might forever. Amen.
God dwells in unapproachable light. No one can see or see. Well, but they saw God, right? Ezekiel, in Exodus 33:20, Moses is saying, show me your glory. And God says, you cannot see my face and live. And we know that God is not a part of the created universe. He is a spirit. And from him, everything exists. I like to use the example of Hamlet. God is not someone like us who lives in the story above us. All we got to do is climb the stairs and we can get to him and see where he lives. No. He's not 1 or 2 floors above us in our apartment building. Our apartment building exists in his mind and in his imagination. It's a little bit like Hamlet. Hamlet exists in the mind of Shakespeare, much as we and our universe exist in the mind of God. Can you imagine how Hamlet could see Shakespeare? You begin to realize how complex it is. I mean, we're getting metaphysical, but nonetheless, it still gives you an idea of how difficult it is to see God. And yet, they saw God. And what they saw was a presentation of God's glory, and that leads to Joshua's first lesson at this meal. And that is the glory of God. What do you think of when you think of glory? What's glory mean to you? This is your chance.
Power.
Power. Okay, what else?
Oh, weight. God's
Weight.
glory is
Okay,
weight.
talk about that in a minute. Yep.
Brightness.
Brightness. Right. Light, right? What happened to Jesus when he was transfigured? He became bright as lightning, right? We always think of that. Anybody ever see the movie Cocoon? Yeah, I haven't seen the movie, but I just saw some part of it. But in the part that I saw, apparently these aliens came and they looked like people. And at one point, they would go like this. They go, and what did you see? Like they were pulling back a mask and there was this bright light. Sure. We think of glory that way. It's light and color, precious minerals, incredible beauty. In fact, indescribable beauty. Paul says that he was caught up to the third heaven and he saw things it wasn't permitted to even speak of. In 1 Corinthians, Paul tells us, eye hath not seen nor ear heard, neither has it entered into the heart of man, the things that God has prepared for them that love him. There is no way you and I can understand what it will be like when we pass through that door to the other side. But it will be, as you see here, wonderful. Alvin, you have something to say?
In Hebrews, the first chapter, in the third verse. Yes, the third verse. And he, speaking of Jesus Christ, and he is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power. So, is this not a theophany?
Yeah, we'll call it a theophany, sure. There's lots, all these visions would be theophany. The Moses at the burning bush is a theophany. Jesus is not a theophany. Jesus is the second person of the Trinity. I want to go back to somebody said weight. Because the word glory actually carries with it the concept of mass or weight, or what we might call today gravitas. Right? God is significant. He is important. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Great Divorce. And I hesitated to read this, but we're doing okay, so I think I will. It's a description of some people leaving Earth and going to heaven in a bus. It's fascinating. But they're leaving, and they leave the Earth behind, and this bus travels through space, and they look like they're seeing a cliff up there, a massive cliff, and they come up above the cliff. They discover that what they're coming to is a grassy plain with mountains in the background, and now they are in heaven. And they settle down on the grass, and they open the door, and the people are allowed to get out. It talks about the passengers, the men. The men were, as they always had been, as all the men I had known had been, perhaps. It was the light, the grass, the trees that were different, made of some different substance, so much solider than things in our country that men were ghosts by comparison. Moved by a sudden thought, I bent down and tried to pluck a daisy that was growing at my feet. The stalk wouldn't break. I tried to twist it, but it wouldn't twist. I tugged till the sweat stood out on my forehead, and I had lost most of the skin off my hands. The little flower was hard, not like wood or even like iron, but like diamond. There was a leaf, a young tender beech leaf, lying in the grass beside it, and I tried to pick the leaf up. My heart almost cracked with the effort. And I believe I did just raise it, but I had to let it go at once. It was heavier than a sack of coal. And as I stood, recovering my breath with great gasps and looking down at the daisy, I noticed that I could see the grass not only between my feet, but through them. I also was a phantom. When we say glory, it means weight. It means realness. It's not that we are not real, but the unseen world of which God is a part, to which he beckons us, is infinitely more real than we are. That's what 1 Timothy means when it says, take hold of the life that is really life. See, God offers us life that is really life. Now, what's the point of all that? I mean, why the vision? Well, three things I want to give you. First of all, it tells Joshua and tells you and me that God is incomparable. Jack, would you pick up Isaiah 45, 5-7?
I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me, so that from the rising of the sun to the place of its setting, men may know there is none besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form the light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things.
If you want to get a feeling of who God is, Isaiah 40-46 has many passages like this. He says, there is no other. It's the foundation of the notion of monotheism, which is central to Judaism and Christianity. I am God, there is no other. Look, no description of the gods of men comes close to what we've been looking at. None. He is incomparable. There is nothing like him. Secondly, he is supremely desirable. We are not repelled by light and brightness and brilliance. No, we're attracted to that. When the guy from Cocoon goes like this, we think, oh, wow, that's cool, right? Precious metals, precious stones. These are things that are precious to us. And God is supremely desirable. One of my favorite short stories appeared in 1955 in Good Housekeeping magazine. It was written by Jack Finney. It's called Of Missing Persons. How many have read it? Somebody here helped me find that story. I heard about it and I couldn't remember it, and somebody gave me a copy of that article. But it's a wonderful story. Can't tell you the story. But Charlie Ewell is a burned out bank teller who's sick and tired of the rat race. Lives in a city. He's sick and tired of the dirt, the struggle, the daily grind, and the routine. And he hears that there's a planet called Burna, light years away, and there's a way to get there. And that planet is lush and beautiful, and the people are all good, and everybody is happy, and all the things that we kind of desire. And he goes to a travel agency where he sort of hits what he wants, and they give him a brochure. And he sees pictures that are more than just pictures. They're really incredible pictures. And here's what he says. Quote, I wanted to join them. The most desperate longing roared up on me from the bottom of my soul to be there on that beach after breakfast with those people in the sunny morning. I could hardly stand it. Have you ever been touched by something so supremely beautiful that you ached to know more of it? You see, Lewis tells us that this is one of the things that tells us that we are made for something else. He calls it joy, that ache. It's pain, but it's joy. And from time to time, God gives us a glimpse into that which is truly good and truly beautiful and truly representative of his heaven. And we cannot stand the pain. We long to be there. God is supremely desirable. Psalm 37:4 says, delight thyself in the Lord, and he shall he shall give you the desires of your heart. The deepest desires of your heart. A Jaguar sports car used to be a desire of my heart. It's no longer anymore. And we think there's lots of things that we desire in our heart. But the deepest desire in our heart is him and his glory. And then lastly, God's glory gives hope and meaning to life. You know, life is tough. I hear the stories of people who suffer. Some of you in here have suffered more than most of us. And I say, there's a lot of pain in this world. There is. There truly is. There must be more if we are to endure a life of pain and suffering. Whether it's a great amount of suffering or a little, there must be more. In 2 Corinthians 4, 16 to 18, Paul tells us something. Go ahead, Jack.
Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal.
Anthropologists doing studies of prisoners of war will say, as long as the prisoner has the hope of rescue, he can survive almost anything. When he loses hope is when he dies. And so you and I, in this world, like Joshua, need to comprehend and anticipate the glory of God. The city of the great king, the new heavens and the new earth in which righteousness dwells. We need to keep our eyes focused on those things. And I think as we get closer and closer, we all get older, I think we begin like Christian in Pilgrim's Progress to see the glow on the horizon of that city of God that we look for. Like Abraham, city that has foundations that builder and maker is God. So in this covenant meal, second thing that he learns is God seeks our fellowship. Isn't that amazing? Now, he ratifies the marriage covenant, and there's not point in spending a lot of time on that. That's very often done in the ancient world. You had a meal when you executed a treaty or a covenant. But then beyond that, this window into the unseen world is open to us. Human beings had no part in opening that window. God opens it to us, and he invites us into that. That's important. The unseen world is primary. Hebrews 11, verse 3. Jack.
By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible.
I often answer people who are evolutionary secularists. I say, that's my credo. Things that are seen are made by that which is not seen. So your credo is, by faith, you understand that the world was not made by God, and that the things which are seen were made by the things which are seen. That's the difference between them. Secondly, that which is unseen is eternal. It's important. It is permanent. 2 Corinthians 4:18.
So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal.
All right, that's what's eternal. That's what matters. That's what we should focus our hearts on. That's why the apostle says, set your minds and your hearts on things above, not on things on earth. That will give you the hope. That gives life meaning. That gives direction and purpose. You know, it's one thing for us to know that the unseen world exists, but it is an entirely different thing to be invited into it. And that's what this is about. God seeks the fellowship with men. We need to know this if we're going to avoid the trap of naturalism, the notion that everything that exists is what we can see, hear, touch, taste, or smell. You know, to know that God exists, that unseen world exists, and that he's the rewarder of them that seek him is the very beginning, not only of wisdom, but also of any kind of relationship that we might have with our Creator. God seeks a personal relationship with men. He doesn't only reveal himself, but he actively seeks out our fellowship. In Revelation 3:20, it says that famous verse, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and will open the door, I will come in and eat with him and he with me. We will have a meal together, just like this one. God reaches in, he says, let me in. I desire. And interestingly enough, this is a picture, not of the fellowship of equals, And I chose this picture. I don't know if I can get through it. This is our grandson who's on the autistic spectrum. And he's the sweetest boy. 16 now. 15, sorry. Okay. 15. But notice we're on a sailboat. I love to sail. And I'm actually steering the vessel. But he's there and he thinks he's doing it. You see? And the relationship that God requires of us or desires with us, it's not one of equals. It's one of family with father and child, father and son, father and daughter. There's an authority there, yes, but there's also a great deal of love. And he is guiding our ship, even when we think we are guiding. God's ultimate plan is to dwell with men. Revelation 21:3, Jack.
And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God.
He will walk with men as he walked with Adam in the cool of the day in the garden. You know, Jesus gave us an invitation in Matthew 11:28-29. He said, come unto me, all you that labor and heavy laden. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon me and learn of me. For I am meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest in your soul. You know, during the 2008 presidential campaign, Michelle Obama got up speaking for her husband, and she said, my husband will heal your soul. Well, Obama did not heal anybody's soul. He didn't stop the oceans from rising. Didn't do a lot of things he said he would do. But Jesus can heal our souls. And our souls need healing, which is why that was such a popular theme. Now, third thing, not only does God seek our fellowship, we must cultivate fellowship with God. Joshua did that. He stayed up on the mountain waiting for Moses to come down, because it says later on that he and Moses were walking down, and Joshua says, what's that? The sound of war in the camp? And Moses says, no, not the sound of victory. It's not the sound of defeat. It's the sound of singing and revelry. So they were together. Somehow Joshua stayed up there. Must have camped up there or something. I don't know. But anyway, after the rebellion was brought under control, we are told of a place where Moses and Joshua met with God. It's called the tent of meeting. It's not the tabernacle, because the tabernacle hadn't been built yet. And later on, the tabernacle sometimes is called the tent of meeting. But at this point in time, there was a tent, and Moses would go to it, and the cloud would come down on it, and he would. This is when he came out, and his face was radiant. You may know that story. That's not my point. Exodus 33:7 and then 11, Jack.
Now Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp some distance away, calling it the tent of meeting. Anyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside the camp. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks with his friend. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young aide Joshua, son of Nun, did not leave the tent.
Interesting. He stayed behind, didn't he? Why? What do you think he did? Well, he maybe prayed. Maybe he said, I want to know this God that Moses is familiar with. Maybe he worshiped. Maybe he also spent time writing the book of the law for Moses as a scribe. And what I want you to notice is, those are three things you and I can do. We're not Moses' scribe. I mean, we can spend time in prayer. We can spend time in worship. And we can spend time in God's word. In fact, later on, it says in Joshua 1, verse 8, that there's an emphasis on staying in God's word. I call this intentional proximity. What do we do when we fall into sin? Do we want to come to church? Do we want to go to our Bible study? Do we want to spend time in prayer? Or what do? We tend to drop those things, don't we? We want to get away. And if we would counter that and grow in this relationship, we must practice intentional proximity to God. We should spend time in God's word, time in prayer, time with God's people. Joshua 1, the very first chapter of Joshua, makes a big deal of that. Chapter 1, verse 8, Jack.
Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful.
So how do we practice intentional proximity? Well, it's through those things, but I would add, there is no substitute for time. I'll tell you, I try to have a quiet time like most of you do in the morning, maybe a half hour, maybe 40 minutes. And I love that time. When I'm not teaching, that's the only time God gets. And I don't feel very close to him. But when I'm teaching, well, knows this, right? Boy, you spend hours in the Word, and it just fills you up. And that is when I feel closer to him. You can't trade time. You need to spend time with him. We have the example of Jesus, who frequently separated himself, and he spent time on the mountain to pray. Okay, so those are the three principles that come out of that covenant meal on the mountain: the glory of God, the fact that God seeks our fellowship, and how desperately we need to cultivate proximity and a relationship with him. The next one we're going to hit, and it won't be very long, but is the golden calf rebellion. I don't need to tell you the whole story. You know it pretty well. Within about 6 weeks of the covenant ceremony, where Israel has said, yes, we will do all that the Lord says. They'll enter into covenant. We're going to be your special people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They violated. They made an idol out of gold, and they worshipped it, and they went into a pagan orgy around it, and the entire nation was out of control. And this is how the camp might have looked to Joshua and Moses as they came down. This picture up here is the raw footage. I mean, that you're looking from up on the mountain, not all the way up. You're looking down. This looks like there was some water here at one time. And there's a big plain. And so an artist has put some water in here and colored in the area where these 1 million or 2 million people would have set up a tent city. And that's where they spent all this time. So now Joshua's coming down with Moses, and he says, what's that I hear? Right? Moses told him what it was because God had told him. God gives him the news in Exodus 32, 7-8. Jack?
Then the Lord said to Moses, go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and have said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.
So Joshua had to learn something. He had to learn that one cannot trust the innate goodness of men. One can't trust the perfectibility of mankind. There is a human nature, and it is sinful. We are subjects of Satan by nature and by choice. And we must make a positive choice to renounce that citizenship and seek citizenship in heaven through Jesus Christ. And it says, straight is the gate and narrow is the way, and few there be that find it, that leads them to life. We should seek it with all our heart. Why is it that when the power goes out, bad things happen? Whether it's New York City or anywhere else, the police, if you defund the police, why does evil prosper and fill in the void? If you're a statesman especially, or a leader, you must recognize the reality of the sinful depravity of man. And whatever you do, you have to deal with it. You can't avoid it. We have checks and balances in our system because it's based on a Christian view of men. And we are breaking those down because we believe man can be perfected, and that good men, experts, the best of men, can be raised to positions of power, and they can create heaven and earth. And we are so deadly wrong. What we will do is we will create hell on earth. We should govern accordingly. Jeremiah 17:9 says that the heart of man is deceitful and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And that's true. But beyond that, we should not trust the goodness of our own hearts because we're not good. And we have that same human nature. God has given us a new nature, and he says, put on the new man, put off the old man. There is a struggle that goes on within us, and we desperately need the grace of God to hold us to himself. We need to set boundaries. We need to pray, lead us not into temptation. We should labor diligently, as Peter says, to make our election sure. I want to see evidence that God has worked in me to change me. I want to see that new nature growing in me so that when I come to him, he does not say, depart from me, I never knew you. That to me is the most terrifying verse in the Bible. Matthew 7:28. There's a hymn called Come Thou Fountain. It says this, one of the verses says this, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the Lord I love. Here's my heart. Now take and seal it. Seal it for thy courts above. You ever sung that? Oh, yeah, I'm sure you have. Lesson 2 is the destructiveness of sin. I mean, think of the laws that they violated and the covenant they had just agreed to. They were in this pagan orgy of sex and singing and dancing before the new God, verses 18 and 19. They had violated the first 4 at least. Okay? And in violating the first 4, the other 6 immediately will follow. We see this in Romans chapter 1, where it talks about how men did not glorify God when they saw the creation. They are without excuse. They began to worship created things. What happens next? Sexual sin, then sexual depravity and perversion. Then God gave them up to a depraved mind to do all sorts of wickedness. And we're on that continuum, aren't we? And we're moving down it pretty fast. It's got the same pattern. Israel's very existence at this point was threatened. Look, a nation cannot live in that kind of agony, anarchy and survive. And so if we're going to eliminate that, we must suppress that evil through violence. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Now it says they were a laughing stock to their enemies. Well, where were their enemies? They were all around them. I believe that Israel was considered prey, much like the Amalekites felt. In any place they were, they would have dealt with having to fend off raiders all over the place. And so by the time they ended up ready to go in the promised land, they were hardened in battle. There was a great deal of fighting going on. So these people were simply waiting to sweep in. I mean, for nothing else, just the water. They're in the desert. God's provided all this water. They're camped perhaps around a great big lake. And anybody would want that. And in those days, what you wanted, you could have it if you took it. And so they were really at the risk of their enemies. And they had to do something about it. The destructiveness of sin. The Bible says that blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. And it doesn't take a lot to see that, does it? Lastly, he learned about the role of power. And as a leader, a statesman, the head of his nation, he understood power. What is power? Well, power is the ability to do violence. I mean, when you boil it down, if you decide that you should not pay your taxes, you don't send it in, what's going to happen? They're going to send you a fine. I'm not going to pay the fine. And then they're going to take you to court, get a judgment, say, I'm not going to do it. What's going to happen eventually? They're going to come in with the guns and they're going to take you away and drag you off into prison. If you resist enough, you may end up getting shot. I mean, power, political power is all about violence, the ability to destroy. But it's necessary. And that's the hard part about it for us. Moses gave the command to restore order in the camp. In verse 27, he gives the equivalent of a shoot to kill order, like Mayor Daley. And the Levites, who were faithful, they went out into the community to restore order. And in the process, about 3,000 out of 2 million were killed. But beyond that, God punished them again with a plague. And we have no idea what the casualty count was on that. Power must be opposed by power, and violent power where it's necessary. Now, why is that just to do that? Well, in Genesis chapter 9 and Romans 13, God gives the power to men to use the power of the sword. In Genesis 9, God says to Noah, if a man takes his life, takes the life of another man, by man shall his blood be shed. In Romans 13, it says that the government bears the sword, does not bear the sword in vain. Even in the home, Proverbs 13:24 says, he who spares the rod hates his children. I mean, we not like to spank our kids. I never enjoyed that. But if we are going to counteract the wickedness that is in the heart of a child, we must do so. But we must do so in love. We must do so under the authority of God's laws, because that's the problem. Somebody's got to execute that power, don't they? David's last words were, immortalized in Handel's Messiah, he that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. He must rule under God's law. We rejoice when God-fearing men rule. It says in Proverbs 29, verse 2, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked bears rule, the people mourn. We understand that, don't we? Yeah. When men who hate God, who hate the Bible, rule, it's not good for not just Christians, it's not good for anybody. And it creates great sadness. When people who fear God rule, then there's joy, there's prosperity, there's good things. Abraham went to Abimelech. Remember Abimelech? He was the local warlord. He came in and he decided he wanted Abram's wife. And in order to take her, he'd have to kill Abram. So Abram said, she's my sister. Hey, they come in with all their warriors. What are you going to do? I mean, there's only maybe 100 to you. There's 300 to them, and they're all armed and ready to wipe you off the face of the map. And so he just takes who he wants. They'd taken a number of others. But God punished him. And then he found out that Sarah was Abraham's wife. And he calls Abraham in and he says, what in the world were you thinking? And Abraham says, when I came into this country, I saw that people did not fear God. And I was afraid. You see? We rejoice when God-fearing men rule. We are afraid when men rule who do not fear God. And I love that song, that antiphonal song. Is he worthy?
Oh, yeah, I do.
He says, is anyone worthy? Is anyone whole? Is anyone able to break the seals and open the scroll? Tim LaHaye used to say the scroll represents the deed to the earth. Is there anyone worthy to rule the earth? Anyone who can execute power with true righteousness? There's one. Is the one we long for and await every single day. And the Bible ends with those famous words, even so, come, Lord Jesus.